introduce our panelists. I'm going to introduce them all, and then we'll start with the first one. So Sergio Carranza is the Executive Director of Pueblo Unido, CDC, which is a nonprofit focused on the community and economic development of rural areas in the Coachella Valley. Through community organizing, training, and education, they have formed several collaborations with public agencies, and they run the Polanco Rehabilitation Assistance Program, centered on the largest population of mobile home parks in California. Second, Steve King is the Executive Director of the Oakland Community Land Trust, which was founded in 2009 and is focused on expanding and preserving housing and economic development opportunities for Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and low-income communities. Valerie Jameson is the founding executive director of Richmond Land, which is a new community land trust that is building grassroots power for a just transition of land use and affordable housing in Richmond and Contra Costa County. Valerie is a homegrown resident who began engaging in land and housing efforts out of a need to stabilize her neighborhood, combat displacement, and coordinate among movement building efforts that are fighting to reclaim community control of land and housing. And some of you may remember Zachary Murray, who was with us a few months ago. He also worked at the Oakland Community Land Trust with Steve and is currently a consultant at Up South, Down South, which conducts policy research and supports community development organizations and government officials. His work focuses on affordable housing funding, community land trusts, and rural and agricultural cooperative land efforts. So those are our speakers for today. I am going to give everyone 8 minutes to talk at the front end, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So let's start with Sergio. Sergio, can you tell us about the community need that Pueblo Unido is trying to meet and why you're using the strategies you're using?
Thank you, Zanetta, for this opportunity. I am a native from El Salvador, and it was very natural for me to get organized because I experienced in my own blood in the struggles of the Civil War in the 1980s. So when I moved to the States, ended up here in the Coachella Valley, and my first work, my first job was to do community organizing, and my job was to basically go to the rural communities, living in mobile home parks, and to try to figure out a way how we can organize again unscrupulous slumlords. And basically, as we were approaching those communities, I just found so incredibly similarities to the people I used to work back in El Salvador in rural communities. So what I learned is something extremely remarkable, that family living in the mobile home park community, basically they organize themselves organically. They used to work and used to live in what they call labor camps, and little by little, these owners were closing these parks because they were getting into a lot of code violations. Many of them basically were growers and leave little time to families to reorganize. So as I learned, the families actually start to get together and start to invest in land, and also to bring their used mobile homes for this potential relocation. So this initiative that came organically with no technical assistance, with no financial support, with no public policy available to them, created the largest population of mobile home parks in California, if not in the United States. And that for me was remarkable because that shows the level of leadership and an initiative that this farm workers community, which is very unique here in California, was able to do. They didn't know what they were getting into because basically it was a cultural approach. Back in Mexico, you have families owning big pieces of land and you don't need permits. You basically build your house, and everything goes fine. And you move your relatives and family if they don't have anything to anywhere to live. So that's exactly what happened here. They were replicating a cultural value towards achieving affordable housing. The problem with that is that the local county never anticipated the uh, the population growth. They did not anticipate uh, the magnitude of lack of affordable housing. And at one given point, we have up to 400 unpermitted mobile home parks of these natures. So we are not talking about huge mobile home parks. We're talking about smaller
Right.
mobile home parks up to 12 units, which is what they used to live before. So they basically replicated that model. What the community didn't know that in the 1990s, uh, Senator Richard Polanco introduced a law, the Employee Housing Act, to incentivize growers to build affordable housing for their employees. So this is the most creative way to actually achieve affordable housing in partnership with the growers. This law doesn't require to have conditional use permit, don't require to have sequence report. Everything goes directly to construction. But the family didn't know anything about it. So basically, what I learned about all these efforts that the community has done, I realized that number one, we need to start organizing the community and to provide training and education. But at the same time, we need to establish a comprehensive technical assistance program so that we can assist families with dealing with local government, trying to find financial resources for rehabilitation, and also to find financial resources for replacement of mobile homes. It is important to note that many of those mobile homes are mid-century old.
Right.
It's just unbelievable, and they're
Right.
still living under those conditions. So creating a major havoc and challenge. So that's basically my interest. We created Pueblo Unido to actually give the community a voice. They actually are the drivers of this change, and those are actually transformed into Pueblo Unido platform so that we can respond to those needs. In addition to that, we have in our board of directors representatives from those families to validate and ensure that we are actually creating those adequate public policies and strategies to actually respond to their needs. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what is it that we do. And basically, we also work towards bringing infrastructure, which is drinking water and sanitation as the foundation of any rehabilitation of mobile home park. And of course, the actual rehabilitation of Polanco parks so that we can bring better living conditions to those communities.
Thank you. And I'm sure there will be questions, but that's a perfect overview. For folks who just joined, we are hearing from the panelists sort of a brief overview of their work and how they came to it. And then we are going to go into breakout sessions and have more of a dialogue. Um, so next I want to turn to Steve and ask you if you can tell us a little bit about how the Oak CLT works to expand housing and economic development opportunities in Oakland and how you came to this work.
Sure. Thanks, Anita and Allison, for inviting me to be a part of this today. Oakland Community Land Trust, as you said, we were founded in 2009 at a specific moment in history of crisis during related to foreclosure. And at that time, the Community Land Trust was really seen as a vehicle in Oakland for residents to gain community control over vacant and foreclosed homes in the city. of which there were, nearly 15,000. So that was the impetus for starting this new entity. It grew out of a specific organizing effort between two community-based organizations, the Oakland chapter of ACORN at the time, and an organization called Urban Strategies Council. And so from the start, we've been focused on preservation. We've never done any new construction. It's really been a really concerted focus on preserving existing housing and community assets and bringing them into the land trust for permanent community use. As time has gone on and we've grown a little bit in terms of the work, we've really expanded along with the changing nature of crisis in Oakland and how the housing market has shifted. And really at the request of residents and some of our community partners to start acquiring different types of housing and different types of properties. So we've really seen the community land trust as a tool to advance both resident identified and sort of community partner identified strategies around preserving land and housing and community space. And so over the past 4 or 5 years, we've really focused on preventing the displacement of existing residents in where they're at in occupied housing and developing a strategy that is suitable to that small site housing, single family homes up to small multi-unit buildings, and a strategy where we can partner with residents in those situations and acquire their housing and work towards a pathway where they eventually take ownership of the housing through the community land trust. And so that over time, as we've kind of broadened how the community land trust can be used as a tool in Oakland, just seeing a much more open field in terms of the uses that the CLT as a tool can really be put towards. So I'll just talk a little bit about a few of those. And so we've continued to acquire single family homes, both vacant and occupied, in partnership with residents. We've acquired multi-unit apartment buildings and mixed use buildings that have both affordable apartments and community serving commercial space for nonprofits and worker-owned cooperatives. We've acquired vacant land through vacant tax defaulted land, so land that was effectively abandoned by previous owners and foreclosed upon by the county. We've partnered with the county to be able to acquire some of that land and are currently in the process of transitioning that into food producing land with our residents. So that's kind of the breadth of uses we're advancing currently with the land trust as the sort of central organizing tool for that. In terms of seeing, or now that we have a base of going on 150 residents in the land trust, we've started to see the opportunity to advance other strategies beyond just housing. So now that folks have stable access to housing through the CLT and ownership through the CLT, we've particularly since the pandemic started, we've been having all resident meetings on a monthly basis and developing different strategies that are emergent from the residents. And one is this creating a scattered site urban farm on the land that the CLT owns. And so that there's a whole subcommittee of residents that are working on developing that with some potential opportunity for social enterprise and potential revenue generating streams for residents. And similarly, we have a committee of residents that are working on worker-owned cooperative development. So that's kind of just a thread of how the housing work we've done is leading to potential other opportunities of or creating avenues for economic opportunity for for our residents and, the surrounding community. Maybe I'll just stop there since that's kind of a broad overview.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. For folks that are just coming in, we're just hearing from the presenters, and then we will be moving into a breakout session.
Sunita, if I can just mention that Angie's internet is going in and out, so she's going out and coming back in. So sorry about that.
That's fine. And if she wants to call in, if that's easier, she could do that too.
Oh, okay. You catch it?
Okay, so
Thank you.
I'll send you the number. Valerie, hi. Can I ask you to tell us about how Richmond Land got started and what you're trying to build?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Hey, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I feel like in order to actually, appropriately approach this question, I also have to take a second to talk a little bit about my entry point into the field and into the world of community land trust. And it was completely by accident. I always state really explicitly that I didn't come into the work that I'm doing now because I studied or really quite frankly understood community development, real estate, or urban planning. I come to this work when I say I'm a homegrown Richmond resident. What that means is, I'm someone who's been politicized at a very young age in my local context, understanding that we need to be doing everything that we can for our communities to be thriving. And that is me being very targeted in my intention of being in Richmond, rooted here, and focusing on efforts in Richmond. And for a long time, that looked like education justice. It looked like organizing and advocacy within the space of, supporting and empowering youth, supporting and empowering residents. And over time, there was a moment of reflection where I really had to look around and say, as we are continuing to advocate for revitalization, as we're continuing to advocate for community, how many of the people that we envisioned being the benefactors are really here and are still able to enjoy the luxuries of any new efforts that at the time, there was a lot of like a surplus of like urban farming. There was a lot of intention around our youth center growing and all these resources being available. And so that critical consciousness for me was a pivot of saying, we can't continue to just push for sound policies and advocate for different efforts. We really need to make concerted efforts to create alternative models of sustaining our community first and foremost. And so that brought me into the world of the community land trust before I even understood that that's what it was. And so for Richmond Land, we started convening. I was a member of the founding board in 2018. It came out of a failed project with the University of Berkeley, who was looking around when it was deciding where it wanted to purchase property and decided that Richmond was, quote unquote, one of the most affordable cities in the immediate Bay Area, and purchased a property that, they had a vision was going to end up becoming a third of the size of its existing campus, and was going to be the big economic engine that was going to shift the tides for Richmond. It was going to bring Richmond into the new generation of like non-extractive industry, because right now we're so focused and dependent on our revenue coming from the Chevron refinery. And right now that's also a piece of just frustration, because we just had a 600 million gallon oil spill that happened yesterday. And so there's just been a lot of challenges with our ongoing experience in our local context of being a community that's been historically disinvested, but yet we are dealing with all these burdens of the displacement and the impacts of living in a region that is so costly. And so there's all these pushes and pulls of what we feel we don't have, in by way of, the type of community development, the type of quality of life and community we want to see, and then the pushes and pulls of that. So our history, starting off, our original name was Richmond Community Owned Development Enterprise, is really important because it in knowing that, the university ultimately backed out of this project in mid 2016, a lot of people, there were so many folks involved in what was a community benefits agreement fight. There were faith-based leaders, there were residents, advocates. At that point, it felt like, okay, how are we going to pivot? What options are there when community, like yet again, are kind of left with like being overly promised and under delivered, a lot of false promises. And ultimately, I always say out of the embers of that was this motivation of saying we cannot continue to rely on external private developers or external entities to bring to bear the type of vision we have for our community. We need to figure out the ways that we are creating the infrastructure and the tool that's going to bring real, genuine, equitable development. And like, what does that mean for us? And how can we be the ones to go out and understand the different industries and be able to bring those resources to bear? And so that was really the motivation behind what later became Richmond Land. And it was through that process so at that time, we didn't even know what a community land trust was. And it was through meeting with different colleagues, doing our research, we understood that really why the community land trust model was an important self-identity for us to opt into is because of the value set that was really, really central to the focus of the CLT movement. For us, our work, just to relate it back to the question of what we're trying to build, it's more than housing. I think right now we have some immediate housing related projects, but more than anything, it's about how are we a conduit for community determined futures? How are we creating a space where we're driving development, we're the decision makers, and that there's both the outcomes that we can control and we can see produced, but the process is one where we're involving residents. Like we're not kind of hoarding this knowledge or hoarding this process to say, only select architects or select developers or select people with these competencies can engage in what their community is looking like and what their community is going to be in the future. And so that's so much of how we approach our immediate work right now, is recognizing that there has to be program components to it, so that we're developing this deeper language around belonging. And so that's just a way for me to disrupt a little bit of just the housing focus. I think housing is the initial focal point because it's about stabilizing community, but so much of what we're trying to build is around sustaining cultural legacies. It's around securing the neighborhood assets. So it's developing them because we feel like we're lacking them. It's developing those neighborhood assets is going to create a community that historical residents have deserved for a long time, and not creating communities for future recipients, with the expectation that as the housing market continues to push and pull, that, all of this development is really being created with the vision of those that are either being priced out of other parts of the Bay or that are cashing out and moving to Richmond. Like we really want to disrupt that narrative and say, no, our communities have been disinvested. And because of that, we need to engage in the space of new development. We need to bring our vacant, our underutilized land, our toxic land into productive use. We need to create and design beautiful communities, but also, like in that process, it is the preservation and the stabilization of those historical residents as one piece. And also, like secondly, is this component that I think doesn't get a lot of opportunity to be discussed, because you hear preservation, you think stabilization, you're thinking about those who are already in your neighborhood. But so much of the experience in Richmond has already been completely shifted since the foreclosure crisis. And there's not a lot of focus around the demographic makeup and how much it's changed. We saw like tens of thousands of Black residents in Richmond instantly being pushed out, many of whom are in Stockton, many of whom are in Vallejo, many of whom are in East County, and we know it. And yet there was really not that concerted focus at that time to address that issue. And what we're seeing is that home and like people's feeling like when we talk about placekeeping and like culture keeping, it's such a complicated topic because we also have to understand that people's familiarity and connection to space and places, like there's so much transience that our communities have had to go through, that there's also a question of how are we allowing and facilitating for communities to return. And that's been a huge component of our programming and really is central to what we're also trying to build, is how are we stabilizing communities and culture, but not just for those who are already residents or still able to keep a tenuous residency in our really complicated landscape, but how are we facilitating and preserving like those aspects of placekeeping. So I'll leave it at that. And I know there's a lot more to talk about in the breakout session.
Thank you, Valerie. So that was a perfect segue to Zach, and if folks have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll bring them up. But what you mentioned, Valerie, about community-driven futures, I think is a good segue to the question I had for Zachary, which was, can you talk about how you think of this not just being about housing, but about the intersection between housing, community stability, and power building in the work that you're doing?
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation. This is a very rich conversation. And Valerie, my mind was really illuminated in a lot that you touched on, I think, on the question that I'm about to address. And I think at the core of what interests me about working on land or community development is that I see land as very critical to power in this country. And we know that ownership has a tremendous value in this country in terms of the sort of cliche American dream, but also in the ability to develop and the ability to expand. And so I think what drives me towards community land trusts is also the value of democracy. And I think we see housing in general as something that our governments probably shouldn't do because of all the horrors of public housing and the failures in that system. But the reality is that in the community, being able to provide such an essential resource, such essential infrastructure as housing, it's another opportunity for us to practice very actively in democracy. And in the we have moved through an election, but there's still very much a threat to democracy in so many of the institutions in this country. And so I really feel that we have to figure out those ways to do it. And I think, my story in some ways, I feel very similar to the things that Valerie shared in terms of coming from an activist background of organizer parents who instilled in me a political education that motivated me to want to look for community solutions. And so I originally come from Baltimore, Maryland, which is a city that is very much defined by apartheid, American apartheid, historically an exporter of American apartheid, and today very much still so. And so we're dealing with the very intentional economic exploitation and extraction from African-American communities in Baltimore that continues today. And at the same time that we've seen the undermining of whole communities, the militarism in communities that resemble the Civil War, I think that in many ways Sergio described in the streets of America. At the same time now in 2020, we're experiencing gentrification and the very rapid displacement from these communities. And it's very important to me that we understand that even in centers of violence, I grew up in a community full of a lot of trauma, that there's still life that's lived, that people still have experiences of love, that people still have attachments to the place. But at the very same time, that violence, which isn't just violence from the community, but also violence from police, violence from a government that ignores whole areas, whole places, and makes whole communities feel different than other parts of the city, that those reinforce trauma in people's minds about space and about place and about their right to those things. And so, at the core of the work of a community land trust is the very important need to develop developer credibility, the know-how about how to do the financials and make the acquisitions and the deals, but also is all the important work of really envisioning a different future about how we do those things. At the same time that we're working within the system, we're also hoping to invent new systems and work towards the beloved community that we know Dr. King talks about. And that's very active engagement. It's not just the creation of affordable housing units that people can live in and pay 30% of their income towards. It's also the work of understanding very transparently and in ways of accountability how race and class very much define our ability to exist or coexist in a community, and to put those things on the table and to create spaces that are healthy where people can begin to confront those. And so I like that mission that this takes. Any one of us who have spoken could go and join a traditional developer and be a part of building a large number of units and feel a lot of pride in that. But we know the work that's a lot slower of undoing very problematic systems and replanting seeds. I've once heard it described as brownfield remediation, right? We could just build a cap over it and put a new building on top, or we could go in and really unearth all the toxins and all the waste that we've put in there for generations. And we know that that's really the only true heal, is to go through and put those things on the table and begin to address them. And so I think it's a platform for equitable development, but it's also a platform for democracy, and something that we can continue to practice. And as we begin individually as communities where we live to figure out how to practice democracy and to think about equity and institutionalize that practice of inclusion and equity, then that begins to spill over into many other spaces. And so the alternative is so important to driving the future that we're going towards. And that's why it's really a great thing for me to be a part of, and why I enjoy so much working to support communities to build capacity in this space.
Thank you, Zachary. That is just like a little hint of the work that all of these folks do. I will say that one of the things I really appreciated in just hearing your introductions and reflections is that each of you had a different entry point, whether it was looking at farm worker housing or the spill out from the foreclosure crisis, development gone wrong, the apartheid system of Baltimore, but the sort of values and pushing towards building something different that like brings you all to this work. And I think that is true of a lot of the folks that are in this room. So I want to see, before we go into more of a small group discussion, if anyone has questions for the panelists that they might not be in conversation with. And just as a reminder, we're gonna, Valerie and Zachary are gonna be talking to Stockton, and Steve and Sergio are gonna be talking to Fresno. So if you have some questions that you wanna ask either to the larger group or to someone that you're not gonna be in conversation with, please let me know.
I would love to hear maybe from Valerie. You talked a lot about the culture of the place and honoring that in kind of moving forward with development. Are there some real practical ways, or at what, I think one of the things that we're working on is at what point do we do more community engagement? Our community has been very engaged for many, many years, but I think a lot of times they get very engaged, they share their ideas, and then nothing happens. And then we gather again, we share our ideas, and then nothing happens. So I'm kind of trying to balance the point between like getting investors ready to go on a project, getting projects excited, excitement about a project, but then also like pairing that with like the community input and what the neighborhood really wants to come around and make happen. All of those things. So kind of just speak into that.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And I would say for a while, I spent a lot of time trying to curve my language to not use the phrase community engagement and talk about like community activation and really working in partnership with community, because I see myself as that coming into this work in a very grassroots way. Is I don't want to compartmentalize and say, this is the time that we engage community, this is how we engage community. It's been a lot of how are we, so there's multiple ways I'll approach this, but I'll try to be brief, and then we're gonna have longer conversations on it. But it's really important that we are drawing down what's going on in the development process with residents, and that they're side by side with us, so that it's not a sense of